On a pond at the edge of a Chinese village, a farmer scatters grain and watches his ducks scramble for it. And what he cannot see is that every one of those birds descends from a wild ancestor that science has never found. A ghost duck that may no longer exist anywhere on Earth. The flock here is white and brown and mottled, dabbling along the reeds, indifferent to the people on the bank. They have been here, in one form or another, for a very long time. Longer than the village, longer than the rice paddies terraced into the hills behind it. The duck is one of the quietest animals in human history. It does not pull our plows or guard our homes or carry us into battle. It swims, it feeds, it lays its eggs, and it asks for almost nothing. For thousands of years, it has lived at the soft margin between the wild world and our own. Never fully tamed, never fully free. We thought we knew where it came from. We thought it was simple. A wild mallard, the green-headed drake every child can draw, slowly coaxed into the farmyard somewhere in the marshes of ancient China or Egypt. A short story. A familiar one. We were wrong about almost all of it. When geneticists finally sequenced the genomes of domestic ducks and laid them beside the wild birds we always assumed were their ancestors, the numbers refused to line up. The dates were impossible. The ancestor we had named did not match, and hidden in the DNA was the trace of a wild duck that no one has ever sampled, a ghost population that may no longer exist. The duck on the pond is not the bird we thought it was. Its origin is older, stranger, and less certain than any textbook ever admitted. This is what the DNA actually shows. For a long time, the question of where ducks came from seemed almost too obvious to ask. The answer was sitting on every pond in the northern hemisphere. The mallard. The mallard is one of the most widespread and adaptable birds on Earth, found across Europe, Asia, and North America, thriving in city parks and wild estuaries alike. The drake's iridescent green head, the hen's mottled brown, the whole familiar shape of a duck. Domestic ducks, with very few exceptions, look like mallards that have been reshaped by the farm. They come in the same body plan, they quack the same quack, and many domestic breeds can still interbreed freely with wild mallards and produce fertile young. So the conclusion drew itself. Somewhere in the ancient world, people took wild mallards, kept the calmest and the fattest, penned them near water, and over generations turned them into the white farmyard ducks we know today. China was the obvious birthplace. Ducks appeared deep in Chinese agricultural history, raised in flooded rice fields, herded along canals, central to the cuisine and the economy of the wetland South. The story fit the landscape perfectly. Rice paddies made standing water. Standing water drew wild ducks. Wild ducks became tame ones. Each piece of the theory had its evidence, and none of it was foolish. The landscape itself seemed to argue for the story. In southern China, integrated rice and duck farming is an ancient practice. The birds released into flooded paddies to eat insects and weeds and snails, fertilizing the crop as they go. A closed loop of grain and bird that some farmers still run today, exactly as their ancestors did. Herders walked flocks of hundreds along the canals with a long bamboo pole, and the ducks learned to follow it like a flag. Salted duck, pressed duck, the lacquer-skinned roast ducks hung in shop windows. The bird was woven so tightly into the food culture of the Yangtze and the Pearl River deltas that imagining a Chinese origin required no leap at all. The duck belonged to the water, and the water belonged to China, and the line between wild and tame seemed only a matter of which side of the canal bank a given bird happened to be standing on. There was a second candidate ancestor too, a bird less famous in the West but well known across East Asia. The Chinese spot-billed duck is a close cousin of the mallard, with a darker body and a distinctive yellow-tipped bill. Some researchers working with short stretches of mitochondrial DNA from Chinese domestic breeds argued that domestic ducks carried the signatures of both wild species, that the spot-billed duck and the mallard had each contributed to the farmyard flock. Others, looking at different markers, insisted on a single mallard origin. The debate ran for years, fought over fragments of genetic code, and it never fully resolved. But underneath all of it lay an assumption that no one had truly tested. Everyone agreed the ancestor was a duck alive today, a bird you could go out and net on a modern pond. The whole project was about matching the farm duck to one of its living wild relatives. The options were the mallard, the spot-billed, or some mixture of the two. The methods, for decades, leaned on small windows into the genome, a few hundred base pairs of mitochondrial DNA, a handful of genetic markers. It was like trying to identify a stranger from the shape of a single fingerprint smudge. The signal was real, but it was thin, and a thin signal can be read many ways. To settle the question, someone would have to stop looking at fragments and read the whole book, the entire genome, across many birds at once. That is exactly what a team set out to do. In a study published in the journal BMC Genomics, researchers analyzed 118 whole genomes drawn from mallards, Chinese spot-billed ducks, and a wide range of domestic ducks. This was not a smudge. This was the full text of the genome, read across more than 100 individuals, the most complete look ever taken at the deep ancestry of the domestic duck. They were trying to do something simple to state and very hard to achieve. To find in the genetic record the precise wild population from which the farm duck descended and the moment it split away. The domestic birds in that sample were not a single uniform creature either. They ranged from the heavy white meat ducks to the small egg-laying breeds of the Chinese South, from the upright Indian runner to the laying strains that produce the salted eggs of Cantonese kitchens. Some had been selected for eggs, some for meat, some for down. If the farm duck were simply a tamed mallard, all that variety should have traced back cleanly to a mallard root. The whole genome approach meant the researchers could see not just the maternal mitochondrial line, passed down only through the hens, but the full inheritance from both sexes, the entire shuffled deck rather than a single suit. That completeness is what made the next finding impossible to wave away. They found something nobody had predicted. When the team measured how long ago the domestic duck lineage separated from the mallard, the answer was not a few thousand years. It was roughly 38 years. And when they measured the split from the Chinese spot-billed duck, it was older still, around 54,000 years. State those numbers plainly and the problem becomes obvious at once. Ducks were domesticated by every archaeological reckoning within roughly the last few thousand years. But the genetic divergence the team measured ran back tens of thousands of years before any human kept any duck. The mismatch is enormous. The lineage that became the domestic duck had already gone its separate way deep in the last ice age, while mammoths still walked the steppe and long before the first grain was ever planted. Whatever the farm duck descends from, it was not a recently captured mallard or a recently penned spot-billed duck. The split happened in a world without agriculture, without villages, without pottery or paddies. The ancestor had been a distinct thing for an almost unimaginable stretch of time before a single human ever thought to keep one. To feel the size of that gap, set the two clocks side by side. 38,000 years ago, there were no cities anywhere on Earth, no writing, no farming of any kind. People were painting rhinos and lions on the walls of caves in what is now France. The ice sheets were grinding south. The dog had only recently begun its own long passage out of the wolf and the domestication of every other farm animal. The sheep, the goat, the cow, the pig, the chicken lay tens of thousands of years in the future. The duck's lineage had already been walking its own road for all of that time before the first human reached out to hold one. The bird carried a head start so vast that the entire human story of agriculture fits inside the tail end of it. But here, is where the story becomes strange. If the domestic duck did not descend from the living mallard, and did not descend from the living spot-billed stool duck, then where did it come from? The team's answer is the unsettling heart of the whole study. The domestic duck appears to have originated from another wild duck population, one that is currently undefined or unsampled. A wild ancestor that is not in our collections, not on our ponds, not in our field guides. A bird we have never properly identified. Read that again. The true wild ancestor of one of the most common domestic birds on the planet may be a population we have never knowingly seen. It might be a wild duck lineage that still exists somewhere, overlooked and unsampled, mistaken for an ordinary mallard. Or it might be a population that has already vanished, its distinct genetic identity dissolved or extinguished, surviving now only as a signature buried inside the farmyard flock. The DNA cannot tell us which of those is true. It can only tell us that the bird we always named as the ancestor was the wrong bird, and that the right one is missing. And here, the story becomes darker because of how that ancestral signal has survived. The reason the truth stayed hidden for so long is a process geneticists call introgression, the leaking of genes from one population into another through interbreeding. When the team examined more than 100 genomes, they did not find clean, separate lineages standing apart like species in a textbook. They found pervasive introgression. Genes flowed between mallards, spot-billed ducks, and domestic ducks in tangled, overlapping currents. The boundaries between these birds are not walls, they are smudges. Every time a domestic duck escaped and bred with a wild mallard, every time a wild bird joined a farm flock, a little more genetic material crossed the line, blurring the original signal further. This is why the simple fragment studies kept disagreeing. They were reading a genome that had been overwritten again and again by interbreeding, a palimpsest of crossed lineages. The mallard signature was real, but it was partly the echo of recent mixing rather than ancient descent. The true ancestral line had been steadily diluted, generation after generation, until it nearly disappeared beneath the genetic noise of birds that all looked roughly the same and bred freely with one another. The ancestor was not just lost, it was actively being erased in real time by the very promiscuity that makes ducks so adaptable. The same erasing force is visible across the duck world today, in vivid and sometimes alarming ways. In North America, a continent-wide genetic survey of harvested ducks documented just how readily these birds dissolve into one another. Researchers found that hybrids between the American black duck and the mallard were far more widespread than anyone had realized, spreading westward across the continent. First-generation hybrids in the eastern flyways, and in the central and western flyways, second and third generation hybrids, the offspring of hybrids that had dispersed and bred again with wild mallards. They found 3 species hybrids. In one case, a cross between a northern shoveler, a blue-winged teal, and a cinnamon teal, a single bird carrying the genes of 3 different species. Ducks do not respect the neat lines we draw between them. They never have. The mallard, expanding and interbreeding, is steadily absorbing other duck species into itself, a slow genetic flood that swallows distinct lineages whole. What happened to the domestic duck's lost ancestor is not a freak event. It is the ordinary fate of ducks. The collision can run the other way too, and turn lethal. On the island of Madagascar, on New Zealand, in Hawaii, and Florida, escaped and released domestic mallards have bred so freely with rare native ducks that the wild species are being swamped out of existence, their genomes flooded with mallard DNA until almost nothing original remains. Conservationists have a grim word for it: genetic extinction. A species that disappears not by dying, but by being absorbed, dissolved into the larger pool of a more numerous relative. The Hawaiian duck, the Koloa maoli, survives as a genetically pure population now only on the single island of Kauai. On Oahu, it has already collapsed into a hybrid swarm with feral mallards, the native bird visible only in fragments of its own genome. The New Zealand gray duck, The Pereira has gone the same way, swamped so thoroughly that some surveys struggle to find an unmixed individual at all. The very tendency that erased the domestic duck's ancestor is at this moment erasing these birds too, each new mixed brood a little less itself than the one before. The duck does not go extinct with a last lonely survivor. It vanishes into the crowd. There is one more layer the genomes revealed, and it concerns the long, quiet history of the duck after that ancient split. Even though the domestic lineage diverged tens of thousands of years ago, the actual domestication, the human part, the keeping and feeding and breeding, came astonishingly late. Ducks were among the last major farm birds to be brought under human control, long after dogs and cattle and sheep, alongside or even behind the chicken. For most of the history of agriculture, the duck remained a creature of the margins, a bird that came and went between the wild marsh and the village pond, never fully separated from its wild kin. That long delay, that loose and leaky relationship, is exactly what allowed the introgression to keep flowing and the ancestral signal to keep fading. The duck was domesticated so gently and so incompletely that it never stopped exchanging genes with the wild world. And then, in the most recent sliver of that history, came the transformation that reshaped the duck beyond recognition. For thousands of years, the farm duck remained close to its wild form, a hardy bird that could fly, forage, and fend for itself. But in the last 2 centuries, and especially in the last 100 years, intensive selective breeding remade it. The Pekin duck, the heavy white bird behind most of the world's duck meat, was developed from Chinese stock and carried to the West in the 19th century, the first breeding birds reaching New York in the 1870s and founding an industry on Long Island that would supply American tables for generations. 9 ducks are said to have survived that first Pacific crossing, and from that tiny founding flock, nearly the entire Western meat duck industry descends. From there, it was bred relentlessly for size and speed of growth. Modern commercial ducks grow to slaughter weight in a matter of weeks, on bodies far heavier than any wild ancestor ever carried. Many can barely fly. The Indian runner stands nearly upright and sprints rather than waddles, a living bowling pin of a bird that herders once valued precisely because it could march to the fields and back. The white farmyard bird, with its orange bill and its inability to survive long without us, is a recent human artifact laid over an animal whose deep lineage reaches back into the Ice Age. Beneath the engineered body of the broiler duck lies a wild ghost, the unsampled ancestor, still whispering through the genome. What does this mean for the duck on the pond right now, the one dabbling at the edge of the park while children throw bread? It means that the most ordinary bird on the water carries one of the strangest origin stories of any animal we have ever kept. It is not a tamed mallard. Its true ancestor split away tens of thousands of years ago in an Ice Age world, and that ancestral population is missing, unsampled, possibly gone, surviving only as a trace inside the living bird. The duck is a creature with no confirmed wild parent, a domestic animal whose origin point is a blank space on the map of life. Every duck you have ever fed is, in genetic terms, descended from a ghost, and it means the duck is still doing the very thing that hid its origin from us. Still interbreeding, still leaking genes across species lines, still dissolving the boundaries we try to draw around it. The same force that erased its ancestor is alive on that pond, blurring black ducks into mallards, mixing teal and shoveler, rewriting the genetics of an entire continent's waterfowl in real time. The duck is not a finished thing. It is a current, always flowing, always mixing, never quite resolving into the clean story we wanted. Somewhere in Ice Age Asia, tens of thousands of years ago, A wild duck split away from its relatives and began a lineage that would one day swim on every farm pond on Earth. We do not know which marsh. We do not know which bird. We do not even know anymore what that ancestor truly was, only that it is missing and that its descendants are still here, tipping forward into the green water and coming up shaking droplets from their heads, carrying a vanished bird inside them. If you found this story remarkable, consider subscribing. There are more origins to uncover, and the DNA is only beginning to tell us what it knows.